Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. As you are listening to me right now, I am sure you all have a device on hand that can tell you what time it is. A phone, a computer, a wristwatch. Timekeeping and the organization of our days based on time are central to our lives. On most days, we need to know what time it is precisely and how much time we have left before we switch to another activity. And this is not just in a work environment. It also matters for socialization with friends or family, meetings, and even on holidays or days off. This imperative of timekeeping may be relaxed, but it is still there. The prevalence of time in our lives was not always as strong. It is actually a modern phenomenon that has gained importance over the past 2 or 3 centuries. Timekeeping tends to appear spontaneously in human societies because keeping track of the moments in a day, anticipating daytime and nighttime, or knowing the cycles of the seasons and years is something necessary for survival and social life. This is at the center of our story tonight. I will tell you about the different devices and methods mankind has come up with to measure time. From the most basic observations of the sky, or the first shadow clocks and water clocks, all the way to the quartz timer in your phone and atomic clocks. We will see how they worked and how relevant each of these techniques became to the cultures that used them. And I will also tell you a little bit about the cultural importance of timekeeping and time, which is something that's evolved a lot across time and human societies. But first, I would like to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform allowing you to contribute financially to our work. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and receive regular bonus episodes. We already offer 8 exclusive episodes to our patrons, the latest one about the Lighthouse of Alexandria. This is the first of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that we will explore, and once completed, they will all be edited together to create a 4-hour story. In addition, you will have the capability to download all these audios and participate in selecting future topics. We also offer advance releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we can continue developing Lights Out Library, which we thoroughly enjoy. You will find a link in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. We ask that if you can, please subscribe to the channel and click on the like button. This helps us promote the channel and eliminate advertisements as much as YouTube allows us to. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck and let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, let's begin. What do we talk about exactly when we speak of timekeeping devices? Obviously, we speak of systems and appliances that give us the current time. And not only that, it is also about measuring how much time has passed between two events, measuring years and their possible division into months or weeks, establishing calendars and associating dates with past or future events, which helps us locate them on the time axis. To make these dates make sense, given our representation of time. So, how did the first human societies deal with this? Initially, they simply looked at astronomical bodies, the sun, the moon, and stars, which gave them a rough estimate of time. This helped build the structure, a frame, with the days and years. As they observed, cycles kept repeating themselves. Some of the oldest traces of stone architecture we know of, like Stonehenge, are thought to have been astronomical observatories. One of their functions was to track seasonal and annual events, like solstices or equinoxes. The solstice is when the sun reaches its most northerly or southerly excursion relative to the celestial equator, indicating the longest and shortest days of the year. In the northern hemisphere, this happens around June 21st and December 21st. These dates officially mark the beginning of summer and winter, respectively. The equinox is the time when the sun crosses the celestial equator. Days and nights are approximately the same length when this happens, which occurs twice a year around March 21st and September 21st. Equinoxes traditionally marked the beginning of spring and fall. I'm explaining these things to illustrate that the first elements, the first recurring events that gave frame to timekeeping, were these natural phenomena: the cycle of the day, the cycle of the moon, and the yearly cycle of the seasons. Based on these observations, calendars appeared spontaneously around the world, in written form or not, everywhere. However, we don't know much more than that about timekeeping methods in prehistoric times because they left no other traces. An evolution that seemed to appear in the second millennium BC, more than 3,000 years ago, was the development of devices that kept track of time over shorter periods within a day, using something that moved continuously. Shadow clocks or sundials, for example, used the position of the sun in the sky to determine time. Water clocks used a constant flow of water falling, and candle clocks used a burning candle. If you think about a mechanical watch or clock, the mechanism inside is not in constant motion. It moves at a steady rate. For example, every second a gear moves, and between these movements, the mechanism stays motionless. The invention of such mechanisms for timekeeping that used oscillation happened much later, in the 13th century, and they revolutionized clockmaking. But before that, the only methods to keep track of time were based on continuous processes. Something falling, something burning, or an astronomical body moving in the sky. This doesn't mean ancient methods were basic. They were refined and improved over the centuries, and spectacular machines based on these continuous processes were built from China or India to the Middle East and Europe. So let's take a look at these ancient devices. The very first systems of timekeeping within a day that we know of are shadow clocks, which later developed into sundials. So what is the difference between the two? The shadow clock measures time based on the length of a shadow, which depends on the position and motion of the sun during the day. A vertical stick planted in the ground can be your shadow clock. At the beginning of the day, it will have a long shadow projected opposite the sun. The shadow will shorten as the sun rises to reach its minimum length at midday. Then the shadow will grow long again, but on the other side of the stick as the day advances. The sundial is an evolution of the shadow clock. It uses the same principle of reading time with the shadow of a vertical stick or pole. But the shadow is projected onto a surface with a reference scale, like the needle of a watch, except the needle is a shadow. All major cultures around the world, on all continents, invented sundials. The oldest ever discovered was found in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, the burial place of pharaohs during the Egyptian New Kingdom, and it was dated 1500 BCE. It is possible that the Egyptians used sundials long before that. We also know that the ancient Babylonians made sundials, thanks to references to them on clay tablets. In the first millennium BCE, sundials became frequent around the Mediterranean. The Greeks made many and the Romans adopted them. The first sundial in Rome would have arrived during the 3rd century BCE, looted from a Greek colony in Sicily. One thing the Greeks and Romans realized is that whenever a sundial was moved or transported to another location, it lost its accuracy, which is logical since the position of the sun changes depending on the Earth's latitude. The Greeks, as they were known to do, refined the system and used deduction to better understand what was happening. In the 2nd century, they discovered it was possible to calculate in advance where the sun would be in the sky at a given time and at a given geographical latitude. It was also in ancient times in the Near East and the Greek world that the concept of the hour was established. We are used to counting time in hours, and we know there are 24 hours in a day, each comprising 60 minutes or 3,600 seconds. But this is a convention. Hours are not derived from an observable phenomenon, and one day could have been divided into 40, 20, or 10 shorter units of time instead of 24. So why do we have 24 hours in a day? The Greeks started dividing days into 12 equal portions, and they called these portions of time ora eo ora e. The word hour comes from this. But these hours were seasonal. This means they started at dawn and ended at sunset, which implies that in the winter, when days were shorter, 1 hour was shorter than a summer hour. At the time of classical Greece, only the day was divided into 12 hours. The night was divided into 3 or 4 night watches that also varied in duration depending on the seasons. In the 2nd century BC, the practice of dividing the night into hours began to spread and became the norm. This antique norm of hours that changed duration depending on the season, with longer hours in the summer and shorter hours in the winter, lasted for centuries until the late Middle Ages, when mechanical clocks began to be used. With hours that constantly changed in terms of duration throughout the day, clocks had to be readjusted every morning and evening, which was very inconvenient. Because of this need to standardize time differently, people progressively got used to a system of fixed hours, with 1 hour being redefined as 1/24th of the day, regardless of the season or the duration of day and nighttime. Returning to antiquity, the problem with sundials was that they obviously only worked during the day and when the sky was not too cloudy. For the night, the Egyptians came up with another instrument called merkit, which looked basically like a plumb line. The Egyptians divided the night sky into decans. They would align the plumb line with Polaris, the North Pole star, and by looking at where the other stars were located on either side, they could roughly determine what time it was and how much time remained for dawn. Sundials were useful and also a source of discoveries about celestial bodies and geography. But other methods appear too. One that is probably almost as old is the water clock, also called the clepsydra. In its most basic form, a clepsydra is a vessel or container in which a regulated flow of water falls or from which a flow of water escapes. The level of liquid in it indicates how much time has passed. Here again, the oldest known water clock was found in Egypt and dated from the 4th century BC. But there is older documentation, an inscription in a tomb from 200 years earlier that speaks of a water clock and indicates that the tomb's owner, the court official Amenemhet, would have been its inventor. If true, which is unsure because the ancient Egyptians could brag a little on the walls of their tombs, water clocks would have appeared there by the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. In any case, during the same period, there were probably already water clocks in Mesopotamia. None were found, but inscriptions on 8 tablets from the 2nd millennium BC refer to them. They were used by day and night guards of cities in Mesopotamia. When the guards began their watch, they poured a certain quantity of water into a large container, shaped like a cylinder, with a hole near the bottom. Their work hours ended when the cylinder was empty, a practical use of a water clock to measure a fixed quantity of time. The Babylonians used temporal hours or unequal hours, not fixed hours, because, as I mentioned before, in antiquity, the duration of hours changed with the seasons, since hours were defined as portions of daytime. So the tablets indicate the exact quantity of water to pour into the clock, depending on the period of the year. The guards were paid to watch a certain portion of day or nighttime, not a fixed quantity of time. There can be 2 types of water clocks: inflow or outflow. An outflow water clock means that a container is filled with water, and the water is drained slowly and evenly out of the container. There are markings inside, and the level of water indicates how much time has elapsed. Now, this is the basic principle, the basic form, but it could be improved. The Greeks, the Romans, and the Chinese did it. Water has weight, so the accumulation of weight in a container as time passes can be used to trigger mechanisms with gearing and an escapement mechanism. That is to say, a mechanical linkage that periodically releases a gear train and triggers a mechanism. Imagine the container that gets filled with water is placed on a scale. As it becomes heavier with the passing of time, the moment will come when it will tip the scale, when it is heavy enough. This movement can be transported with gears and chains to moving pieces on a dial or to an automaton. The Chinese, in particular, proved very ingenious at this. They elaborated complex systems based on water clocks. One of the most impressive was the clock tower designed by Zhang, a scholar from the 11th century. He combined a water wheel system with chain drives, gears, and escapement mechanisms to power a sphere representing celestial bodies moving in accordance with real celestial bodies in the sky in real time. And more than 100 striking clock jacks could sound the hours. This tower was a marvel of engineering, powered only by water falling evenly from one container to the next. This astronomical clock tower was over 30 feet tall and was the pinnacle of a millennium of improvements and inventions throughout the first millennium AD. Another Chinese innovation was the replacement of water with mercury for the fanciest clocks. Water works well, but the problem is that it freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. And this is not much of an extraordinary temperature. Mercury is liquid at room temperature and freezes only at 38 degrees Celsius, way lower than any air temperature normally found on Earth. So that was used for big machines that were typically placed outside buildings and could be exposed to really cold temperatures. The original astronomical tower, built by Zhang, was lost, and so were all the machines from the first millennium. We only have the plans. But modern replicas exist, and they revealed the ingenuity and engineering capabilities of their creators. Other systems using containers slowly filling with water were imagined. For example, in India, in the 5th century, at Nalanda in the east of India, there was a Buddhist university where the passing of time was tracked with a bowl holding 2 floats placed in a larger bowl. The first bowl had a small hole at the bottom that let water slowly in, and after exactly 4 hours, this bowl would sink when it contained enough water. Someone would beat a drum to indicate that 4 hours had passed, and the system would be rearmed for a new cycle. A similar system with a bowl sinking in a larger container was widespread in Persia before Islamic times in antiquity. In different regions of Persia that were arid, the rights to access water from springs and rivers were shared between different farmers or estate owners. Each one could divert water from a spring to his land for a given portion of the day. And in order to manage these water rights, people were hired to supervise a water log and ensure that each shareholder of the resource got what they were entitled to. This is one of many examples that show the importance of timekeeping in society. It serves many activities, economy here, but also religious purposes to signal the times of prayers or ceremonies during the day, military purposes to coordinate actions, and for navigation too, which I will elaborate later on. No complex human society can function without norms about timekeeping and methods or devices to keep track of time. The last developments of water clocks, which also gave birth to spectacular machines like those in China, happened in the medieval Islamic world. Various Arab and Persian scholars and engineers built upon the gear mechanisms that had been introduced in ancient Greece and Rome to create even more complex machines. They also used new mechanical parts in water clocks, like epicycle gearing, which was introduced around the year 1000. Epicyclic gearing consists of systems with several toothed wheels within a circle gear, and they are all connected. They transmit their motion to each other but allow for plenty of different ratios or motions. The gears can also move inside the circle gear, which permits plenty of different transmissions of signals and movement. In the 11th century, water clocks using these complex gears were built in Spain, Morocco, and Syria. These works culminated in 1206 with the so-called castle clock, created by Al-Jazari, a scholar and inventor. It was a big device the size of a small house, 11 feet high, 3.4 meters, that had multiple functions alongside timekeeping. On top, it displayed the zodiac on the wheel, with the orbits of the sun and the moon following their path in real time. Under this zodiac, there was a little gallery, a gateway, where a pointer traveled on a hidden card marking the hours. As it traveled, it opened little doors every hour, each revealing a mannequin. Near the base, there were 5 automata, 5 little musicians who automatically played music. and on each side, an automaton resembling a falcon could drop little balls into vessels under them. All these were connected and powered by water regularly flowing from a tank and transmitting energy to water wheels and gears. Together with the Antikythera mechanism that I also told you about in another story, which was 13 centuries older. This castle clock is considered to be an ancient form of programmable analog computer. You put it in place, fill the tank with water, and it would automatically calculate the positions of celestial bodies or kept track of time. At the time it was invented, hours were not fixed units of time yet. That was before mechanical clocks and the definition of hours as 1/24th of a day, regardless of daytime and nighttime, as I told you before. So daytime hours during the summer lasted more minutes than daytime hours during the winter, and the machine took that into account. It could be reprogrammed for the changing lengths of the day and night throughout the year. Another type of device refined during the Islamic Middle Ages was the astrolabe, which is not just a timekeeping device, but rather a broader astronomical instrument. Astrolabes date back to classical antiquity, the first millennium BC, and they were used as navigation instruments too. The astrolabe serves as a star and planets chart, and in its simplest form, it looks like a metal disc with a pattern of wires, cutouts, and perforations that allow the user to calculate astronomical positions precisely. So when you know how to use it, it can help you find a particular star or planet, or determine local latitude if you know the local time, and vice versa. Determine the time if you know the latitude. In the Islamic world, especially Persia, clocks and astrolabes were sometimes merged into a single device. These were never common objects. They were high technology marvels of their time, and only a few units were made for universities or kings. But they showed that the use of gears, escapement mechanisms, and complex systems was intensifying by the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries in timekeeping devices. They were still powered by a continuous process, water falling in that case, but the era of mechanical clocks was approaching. Before we talk about it, there are a few other ancient methods that deserve to be mentioned. These include incense and candle clocks. Both were based on another continuous process, the controlled burning of something. Incense in sticks burns without a flame and evenly. For shorter periods of time, straight sticks could be used, but for longer periods, incense was shaped in a spiral on a disc with a reference mark that indicated how much time had passed since it had been lit. Sometimes the spiral could be made of different incense, with different scents that would indicate the current time with their fragrance. This type of incense clock, which could be easily transported and turned into a home object, became popular in ancient China as a kind of high-end gift. Candle clocks were graduated and slowly burned, were another method based on the same principle. Candles burned evenly and provided their diameter and material were replicated, they could be manufactured in large quantities. These were used in China in the first millennium and in medieval Europe, especially in churches and monasteries, to keep track of time and ring the bells at the times of religious services throughout the day. The hourglass is not as old as one might imagine. It appears to have emerged in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, not before the 11th or 12th centuries at the earliest. The making of an hourglass required the use of glass blowing, which at the time was a form of craft only practiced in Europe. So there is no known trace of hourglasses elsewhere before the first European medieval ones. It appeared late but was a quick success. An hourglass could be used in a wide range of applications. At sea, in churches, in industry, cooking. It was reusable and not too difficult to calibrate, because hourglasses are used for relatively short periods of time. It was not too expensive to make. Glass was somewhat expensive at the time, but considering it was reusable, it remained affordable. It spread to public buildings, homes, and ships, and became so well known that from the 15th century onward, it took on a symbolic meaning in the West. It became a symbol of time itself, death, or simply to indicate that waiting was required. Hourglasses stayed in use long after the introduction of watches and other types of mechanical clocks due to their simplicity. The biggest revolution to date in the history of timekeeping began with the introduction of mechanical clocks by the end of the 13th century. This was revolutionary, first because of their increased complexity, but also conceptually. Mechanical clocks used oscillating devices instead of being based on a continuous process, be it the motion of the sun, water, or sand. A breakthrough was the invention of an escapement mechanism called the verge and foliot around 1275. The verge and foliot consisted of a vertical shaft topped with a crown wheel, this is the verge, that rotated and drove a foliot, a horizontal bar with weights attached on either side near its ends. When the verge rotated, it tried to communicate its rotation to the foliot via the gear wheel, which made the foliot oscillate back and forth, producing a regular tick, an oscillation. The system could be adjusted for longer or shorter intervals between the ticks. If the weights were placed farther from the axis near the ends of the foliot, the oscillation would be slower and faster when the weights were placed closer to the verge. In other words, the verge and foliot was a system that transformed continuous rotation into oscillation. The advantage and really new thing with the system based on oscillation is the production of a signal, a tick, that comes back regularly and can put gears in motion. This is what is called a regulator in horology, a device that maintains a designated value. Typically, in a clock, the tick is calibrated to last 1 second. From there, the system of gears with different ratios will be able to track minutes, hours, days, or even years in more complex clocks. There was already knowledge of gear transmission systems using chains between gears and more complex systems of gears like the epicycle gearing that I told you about before. And now, with the ability to mechanically produce an oscillation, all the ingredients to make mechanical clocks were present. They were first introduced into large tower clocks that had progressively appeared in European cities of the Middle Ages, and were initially water clocks with big dials giving time to everyone. These clocks were convenient, and they were also an element of prestige for the medieval cities that could afford them, or the people who had the means to offer them to their cities. During the 14th century, these big clock towers were increasingly equipped with mechanical systems based on oscillation, and here again, with a lot of creativity from engineers to make them attractive. The fanciest ones had doors opening every hour, and a little show of automatons took place when the bell rang. In practice, the first clocks based on the verge and foliot escapement were very imprecise. Typically, they would drift by as much as 2 hours every day, so they had to be readjusted once or twice a day using a sundial. It was far from ideal, but these clocks became all the rage by the late 14th century. First in Italian cities and slightly later in France and England. Between 1371 and 1380, over just 10 years, more than 70 European cities built public clocks. This tells us the importance of timekeeping in these urban areas of the time. Giving the time was a valuable and necessary public service because everyone needed it. The students, the rich, the poor, men, women, everyone had a life that was timed with work hours, meetings, and time periods during the day dedicated to certain tasks. Very slowly and in a barely perceptible way, people's relationship with time was beginning to change. Lives were less and less connected to sunrise, daytime, and nighttime, the rhythms determined by nature as they had been for all of mankind's history. This was also the period when seasonal hours with durations that fluctuated with the seasons were replaced with fixed hours that all lasted the same and ignored the daytime and nighttime. In the following 300 years, major developments improved the accuracy of mechanical clocks, which, as I mentioned, was very poor at first. Clocks were also large objects, at least several feet high, because the only way to power them, for example, with a counterweight slowly descending, was rather cumbersome. This changed in the 15th century with the invention of the mainspring. Like a weight that is placed high and will slowly descend, the torsion of a spring is a way of storing energy inside a device. Energy that is then slowly and steadily released. Not that steadily at first, actually, and that was the main problem of clocks that limited their accuracy. So new devices were invented to even out the force released, such as the Stackfried or the Fusi, which are mechanisms that help equalize the uneven force released by a mainspring or descending weight. An improvement in accuracy allowed the use of clocks for other purposes than just indicating time, for example, in navigation in the 16th century. If you keep a clock set to the local time of a starting point of your journey, of which longitude is known, you could determine the longitude of any other point you had reached by comparing this original time on the clock with the local time of the place where you had arrived. This helped navigators to estimate more precisely where they were at sea and follow their desired route. So clocks improved. The first pocket watch appeared thanks to mainsprings, but they still needed to be adjusted regularly because of their drift, which could easily be several minutes in a day, despite the improvements to their accuracy since the first medieval prototypes. The era of precision timekeeping really started in the 17th century with another major innovation: the use of oscillators that were subject to harmonic motion. What is this phenomenon, harmonic motion? If you imagine a pendulum in a clock, it moves back and forth or left to right, and always comes back to its central position after the same amount of time. This occurs because its maximum displacement on one side is equal to its maximum displacement on the other side. So it accelerates and produces time intervals between each cycle of oscillation that are always the same. It also works with a mass attached to a spring that goes up and down. The mass falls because of gravity, then it is pulled up by the force of the spring. This type of system will tend to find an equilibrium, a harmonic motion in which the two forces are equivalent and keep the mass going up and down. This could last forever if it happened in a vacuum, but in practice it doesn't, because the mass or the pendulum is attached to something and is also subject to friction from the air. But still, this type of oscillator is much more accurate and lasts much longer without intervention than the first mechanical oscillators like the Virgin Foliot. The era of precision timekeeping began with the introduction of this type of oscillator in horology. The first pendulum clock was created in 1656 by Dutch inventor Christian Huygens, and this helped dramatically improve accuracy. His first prototype erred by only 1 minute per day, and later by only 10 seconds per day, which was something that had never been achieved before. From this point on and throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, intense competition between horologists began to produce even more precise and reliable clocks, which led to plenty of other inventions and techniques with gears that minimized friction, or alloys of materials that were less subject to temperature variations. When you start making very precise devices, the dilatation of the instruments and mechanisms due to temperature variations becomes a problem that can affect accuracy. This was not a major concern before, when clocks erred by several minutes every day anyway. But when clockmakers started aiming for perfection, it became a problem. Many things were tried to solve this dilation problem. For example, by the late 18th century, mercury started to be put inside pendulums to mitigate the effects of temperature variations. And in the late 19th century, a new alloy called invar, which is made from iron and nickel, started to be used because it expands very little with heat. A good illustration of the race toward ever better timekeeping was the development of the marine chronometer. In 1707, the British Royal Navy suffered a disaster off the coast of Sicily in the Mediterranean due to navigation mistakes. 4 ships were wrecked and entirely lost, causing the deaths of hundreds of sailors, just because they were unable to correctly calculate their position with the clocks, charts, and compasses and other instruments at their disposal. As mentioned earlier, ships used clocks since the 16th century to determine the longitude at which they were at any given moment. This worked, but it was still rather imprecise, partly because clocks erred, and this was amplified on ships due to the ship's movement at sea, when clocks needed to remain perfectly horizontal to work as intended. If your clock has a pendulum and you shake it, it is going to interfere with its oscillations. So the British government offered a prize to anyone who would create an instrument accurate enough to determine longitude to within only a few miles. This competition was entered by a clockmaker from Yorkshire, who designed a few years later the first sea clock, which was able to remain horizontal and stopped working if the ship moved suddenly. He used the name chronometer for it, which has remained for particularly accurate timepieces. This need for better devices for practical uses like navigation contributed to the ongoing improvement of clocks. In the 19th century, electricity was introduced as a power source, and with it would follow, a few decades later in the 20th century, the discovery of a new possible oscillator, quartz crystals. As you can imagine, there is no pendulum, spring, or gears in your phone, and yet it is able to give you time. So how does it work? In modern timepieces, time is tracked not mechanically, but electrically or electronically, using the properties of quartz crystals, which can help build devices that are more precise than any mechanical clock could ever be. How is it possible? Quartz crystals have a particular property. They are called piezoelectric, which means that when they are subject to mechanical stress, such as bending, they accumulate electric charges. And it works in reverse. When electric charges are applied to them, they tend to bend. Another advantage of quartz is that its size does not change much as temperature fluctuates. Modern horology uses these properties. Applying electricity to a quartz crystal turns it into an oscillator that produces a very steady signal with precise frequency. The principles of this technology were discovered in the first half of the 20th century, and in the 1960s, the first consumer products using quartz technology began to be sold. In the 1980s, with the development of electronics, quartz timekeepers became very inexpensive to produce and more precise than mechanical clocks and watches by an order of magnitude. So they quickly replaced mechanical clocks. They were added to computers and all appliances that give time. The quartz crystal is what you have in your phone, your laptop, your desktop computer, your kitchen appliances if they give time, and your car. They are everywhere now. Their success has been such that mechanical clockmaking has turned into a niche luxury industry at this point. Having access to time at any moment is now considered ordinary. We need it. Our relationship to time has evolved dramatically over the centuries, and maybe faster than ever over the past 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of precisely timed work hours. A major change in industrialized countries has been a new perception of time by the vast majority of the population. Time has become a resource, and a precious one, a resource that must be put to use, not just for work. There is time for leisure, friends, family, for rest, for oneself. There is lost time and quality time. We take our time or we don't. All of these terms, even when they speak of time as something that has to be enjoyed or used to relax, reflect a utilitarian understanding of time. We have to do something with it. We have some in limited quantity before the end of the day or the end of our lives. For psychology, anthropology, and sociology, this is an interesting field of research. It tells us about how we live and look at our lives. We should not assume that the perception of time was always as it is today. In pre-industrial societies, the urge to accomplish something with every bit of time available was probably not as strong. There is a field of research called chronemics that studies how time is perceived and communicated across cultures with the tools of anthropology, philosophy, or linguistics. Looking at the status, the importance of time and its management can also reveal cultural differences that persist. Just to give an example, the cultural differences in the management and perception of time is what is called monochronic or polychronic time. A monochronic perception of time is the tendency to do things one at a time and segment time into small, precise units. What I referred to before when I told you we have time for different things. There is work time, which itself is segmented into smaller units for different tasks. We have personal time, rest time, socialization time, and these tend to be separate. We don't try to do several things at the same time. In societies that see themselves as monochronic, and this is typically the case in the United States or Northern and Western Europe, this way of segmenting time is taught to us and valued as a way to be more efficient in whatever we do. Now, this is just a cultural trait among many, and it doesn't erase the existence of individual personalities and behaviors. But I guess anyone living in the West can relate to this. For monochronic cultures, time tends to be seen as a resource or commodity. So, sayings like wasting one's time, gaining time, time is money, time is something that we consume. And with this perception comes a high value placed on schedules, tasks, and punctuality as a way of respecting the time of others. This factor weighs heavily in how we live and engage with other people. Again, it is far from being the only factor determining our interactions with others. It is not that simple. For example, the United States is probably one of the countries in the world where this monochronic tendency is strongest across its entire society. And yet, in America, salespersons or servers in restaurants will typically take time to engage in small talk with customers. This is something that almost never happens in Europe. The sales attendant asking a complete stranger how they're doing and pretending to care about the answer would be really awkward in Europe. But in the United States, it's commonplace. So if the United States is monochronic, why do people spend their time doing this? This can happen in a monochronic society because there are other rules. There are rules of civility and politeness that are important, and it is not necessarily contradictory. Giving away a little portion of your precious time and attention to someone you don't know yet is a good way to show that you care about establishing a connection. It is a small gift that makes sense to initiate a transaction. In opposition to monochronic time, there is polychronic time, a trait that has been identified as more pronounced in South Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Polychronic time is the absence of strict segmentation. Several things can be done at once, and time is perceived in larger sections that are more fluid. A more polychronic person will typically base their perception of time on environmental phenomena like dawn or sunset. They will refer less to strict times during the day, which means that strict punctuality is not going to be that important to them. Not out of lack of care or respect for the person they are supposed to meet, but because there is no perception that others will waste their time, as they can always do something else or switch tasks. A polychronic inclination will tend to make people focus more on objects that are not precisely placed on a schedule, whereas a monochronic person will tend to break down into subtasks and fix deadlines and schedules that are going to become intermediary goals. Polychronic individuals also tend to establish shared personal connections with others before a common task is started, whereas monochronic person will tend to see these work relationships as temporary and practical. No one or no society is fully one or the other. It's a continuum. What I wish to illustrate here is how time perception is eminently cultural. The passing of time is an objective phenomenon, of course. That affects everyone, but the way we perceive and live it can vary a lot. Now, returning to technical aspects. I told you that quartz timers were the most widespread timekeeping devices today, thanks to their accuracy and affordability. But they are not the most accurate. The ultimate timekeeping device we have is the atomic clock, which was invented in the 20th century. So what is the atomic clock, concretely? Since the 13th century and the introduction of oscillation rather than a continuous process to keep track of time, more and more accurate timepieces have been made with oscillators. Pendulums are oscillators. Quartz crystals, too. And in the case of an atomic clock, The oscillator is the resonant frequency of atoms. To keep things simple, atoms can have different energy levels. And when their electrons transition from one energy level to another, they interact with very specific frequency of electromagnetic radiation. In other words, they produce an extremely reliable and steady oscillation, a tick that can be used to keep track of time. A mechanical clock with a pendulum knows the time because it counts how many times the pendulum swings back and forth. An atomic clock knows the time because it counts how many times an atom wiggles. Quartz timers improved accuracy by an order of magnitude, and so did atomic clocks compared to quartz. They are accurate to within a few seconds over many thousands of years. A recent atomic clock from 2014 at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States measures time with an uncertainty of 1 second in 300 years. It is almost perfect. The first ever practical atomic clock was built in 1955, and since then many more have been added. There are more than 200 nowadays functioning around the world, and because they became by far the most accurate devices, standard time around the world is now based on them. Since 1967, the duration of a second in the International System of Units has been based on the properties of the cesium atom, a relatively rare chemical element that is used in atomic clocks. A second, if you ever wondered how it was defined, is officially the time that elapses during a bit more than 9 billion cycles of the radiation produced by the transition between two levels of the cesium atom. The numbers don't really matter here. What it means is that this reference of radiation cycle allows for extremely precise definition and tracking of time, which is useful, not just for breaking records. The information given by atomic clocks is used to perfectly standardize timekeeping around the world, and for navigation by satellite networks such as GPS. These systems need very precise information because they indicate the position of objects on Earth by multiplying the time by the speed of light. This means that a timing error of 1 nanosecond, a billionth of a second, translates into a significant error in position, an error of about 12 inches or 30 centimeters. So, these systems needed extreme precision that even quartz devices could not provide. Without atomic clocks, GPS would be far less accurate than it is. It has been a very long road full of discoveries and scientific and technical leaps forward since humans began to measure time with shadow clocks or water clocks 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. I hope you liked this introduction to timekeeping devices. This is all for tonight, but I will be back soon with another story. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.